Hello, and welcome to Authors Die Twice, a podcast about video games and aesthetic theory hosted by two living failures. In this episode, which was recorded a few months ago, we return to the formless format, and Nathan and I talk about a handful of things we've been engaging with recently, including the YouTube channel of ambient music playlists Eleftherios, the 2016 PlayStation 5 remake of the 2007 Call of Duty Modern Warfare, Bethesda's 2015 game Fallout 4, and the Austrian writer Thomas Bernhard. I should also say this is a return in another way of the podcast more generally after a bit of a break. We're happy to be back to our normal schedule, and you can expect us to cover a variety of topics moving forward, including an episode soon on Cy Twombly with a special guest. Anyway, I hope you enjoy this formless one.
All right. Yeah. So my first recommendation or thing that I've been checking out lately is actually this YouTube channel. It's kind of a normie recommendation. And for once the algorithm worked in a non-upsetting way and a way that was actually relevant. So there's this channel called, I have no idea who it is. It's just Eleftherios. I guess we could link it if we want to advertise for them or whatever. I have no clue if it's like an AI generated channel or what, but it's just a series of YouTube like compilations of music, and the each video or like each background is basically like a different picture of a castle. And so it will have, I'm gonna just scroll through some of the titles for the videos. They're all exactly 2 hours long. And it will be like, you've seen this castle before in a dream. You found a dark fantasy castle made from dreams. You just found a serene dark fantasy castle to study in, and so on, right? Yeah, the more that I'm looking at them all kind of aggregated together, it does kind of seem like an AI, generated thing. Um, However, it's kind of each video kind of remixes the same, handful of basically like ambient songs that on the one hand do feel quite video gamey. Like they do kind of remind me of, yeah, like definitely certain games that I played when I was younger. But they're also just great reading music or writing music. And so this winter, I can't remember exactly when I found this channel, but certainly this entire semester, I've like when I get to campus early, oftentimes like 6:30 in the morning or something, it's still dark and no one else is, around. I'll sit in my office and kind of just put on one of these videos and do some reading or grading or whatever it is I have to do. The one thing I'll say, maybe this is actually like functions as kind of a spoiler, is that occasionally the Halloween theme will play, like from the horror movie Halloween, like that really kind of dissonant like piano line that plays in it, and it's always really jarring because it does not belong in any of these videos. But otherwise it's great. Like otherwise it's a really nice kind of cycle of some pretty good, ambient songs to kind of listen to. I don't even know, I wouldn't necessarily say they're ambient either. They're kind of more just like synthesizer music that's pleasant to listen to, you know. Yeah.
This is great, and I have two thoughts about it. One is, you know, it does sound AI generated,
Yeah.
and in a way, there's a kind of I'm actually taking this from friend of the show, Sam Tett, who was watching me play Elden Ring once and was like, "This looks like AI," and I was like,
Hmm.
That's sacrilege. Like these are the most handcrafted games that you can find on the market, and in a way, that's true. But there is also a sense in which like you travel everywhere in Souls games and you just keep finding the same castle, but just remixed.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah.
there are so many castles in Souls games and Elden Ring. Um, and that just makes me think, with very minor variations, it makes me think there's room for a cozy, we've talked about the coziness of Souls games, and we also, with Marty Dolan, we ripped on cozy games, task-based games, but there
Mhm.
is room for what I assume probably already exists somewhere, but like a mod version or an alt version of a Souls game where you just inhabit the same levels, like you don't change the level designs at all or the environments, the castles from Souls games, but just to like write a novel, or like sweep the floors and then like make dinner So like life simulator, routine simulator. But I think particularly as you were describing like writing or reading, that you just read, like your character reads books and works on like social stats or something. But
Yeah.
in a solitary way, I think the solitude is important to the castle fantasy. Like when one imagines being in a castle, it's sort of like you imagine being Dracula, who's like
Mhm.
lord of this like cold uh empty castle, not like a person with like a bustling court or whatever. The other thought was just, and we can stay on that if you want, or leave it aside, but
Yeah.
but you gave a spoiler warning for ambient soundtrack, which is amazing, and it does make me think, is there space to think about musical spoilers. Like it's a pretty stupid idea actually, but just like, hey, in like this Radiohead song is gonna hit a surprising major key like at the end, or like, oh, in like Mahler's second, like the choir is gonna come in out of nowhere. Spoiler alert.
Yeah, I wonder because yeah, that was like a spoiler alert, I guess, for like a negative thing, or at least in my opinion, something that kind of ruins the playlist or whatever. Because yeah, there's absolutely like no reason, that the Halloween theme should just start playing in the middle of this otherwise like pretty honestly like pretty amazing little playlist that goes on. But the other thing though, the idea, I mean, so just to bracket that, I do think like musical spoilers is something I want to think about more because I wonder just having your first time experiencing something get spoiled in that way could be an interesting, not because of a plot, but because of some kind of other mode of anticipation. Um, but in terms of like being solitary in a castle and having that be sort of necessary for whatever kind of fantasy, I like that idea a lot, and it's almost I wonder if that's because you need only just enough structure or only just enough form to execute like what it is that you want to be embodying. So like I think about in Against Nature by Huysman, for example, like he has the protagonist has he has I think two servants and he like forces them to wear like period garb essentially so that even when he like tries never to see them, but even when they walk by his window and the shade is whatever like still there, their shadow will look like somebody from the 1300s or something like that. And so like to have a bustling castle, the amount of kind of curation you would have to do in order to make it feel appropriate would be pretty extensive. So maybe having the empty castles is simply just like a mark of simplicity or something like that. Um, I also just quickly while you were talking, like scrolled. I'm still scrolling actually. This channel goes back over 10 years, and I won't say too much. It just there's a lot of stuff on here, and there's kind of some of it's kind of funny. Um, there is a suggestion, I guess, that some of these soundtracks or playlists are like vaguely self-help oriented as well, which is kind of interesting. So, um, yeah. So anyway, recommendation. It's called Eleftherios, Eleftherios, and
Sorry,
it's
I have to
pretty
stay
good.
on this because
Yeah.
first of all, a self-help version. I love the self-help scenario of being in an empty castle. It's not like actualize yourself by climbing this mountain, or
Yeah,
like
yeah.
actualize yourself by losing weight and running on the beach. It's like actualize yourself by inhabiting a dark, empty castle, a cold castle, and like writing a novel or something.
Yeah.
Um, so that's pretty funny. But also, I apologize. I'm stuck a little bit on the musical spoilers now because I just want to propose. I know we can table it for later, but I want to just propose like a very, very basic. This is probably gonna be obvious to listeners, but I'm just realizing it now. Like, um, categorization of how you just sent me something funny on chat. Of how spoilers like work? Like what is a spoiler? Sorry, this is my
Yeah, yeah.
my crude definition or structural sort of analysis of spoilers. And it does strike me that a spoiler has to be temporal, right? So a painting can't have a spoiler because it's static, or a sculpture. It would be weird to talk about a spoiler in a sculpture. So the temporal arts, film, any narrative, I guess, and music. But then spoiler very often has to do, or I'm tempted to say it. A spoiler is involves content. So a spoiler involves something that's extracted from the specific shape of its delivery or expression. But I have an exception. I have exceptions in mind quickly, but I was going to say, like you could just the paradigmatic spoiler is like this character's going to die, and that's just a content-based event, you know. Um,
But
but
couldn't
then
you?
again, oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, couldn't you spoil a room that has a painting in it then? Like if you change the frame of what a spoiler is, like you could say like, welcome to this museum, like watch out in like this wing, there's like a painting that's really gonna blow your mind or something like that. And that would still be kind of a spoiler. So I just want to throw a little bit of a wrench into that or something.
But that would be a spoiler for the temporal experience of traversing the
Right.
museum.
Yeah.
The spoiler would involve a painting, just like you could say, late in this novel, the character will learn the identity of the killer by looking at a painting. Um, but I was
Mhm.
going to say you could have there is such a thing as a formal spoiler, and I was thinking of the movie Stalker, right? Isn't there in Stalker by Andrei Tarkovsky, don't they when they enter the zone, doesn't it shift from black and white to color? Or is it the other way around?
It's been a long time
I
since I saw
think,
it. I know there's a shift in color for sure. Yeah.
yeah, let's go with the assumption that it shifts to color. That would be a spoiler. That would in some ways dull or lessen the aesthetic impact of the movie if you were like, hey, oh, by the way, like half an hour in, that movie's gonna shift from black and white to color. You'd be like, no, 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 why did you tell me that? And there is stuff like that. You could say, halfway through this game, it becomes a different kind of game. That's true for, I'm gonna spoil a game right now, Inscription. The game Inscription is an excellent game that I think we've talked about before, but that becomes a wholly different game, after the first phase. So yes, this is all to say this is provisional, and you can have form-based spoilers as well as content-based ones. Again, I assume this is obvious to listeners, but I think it would be potentially useful to think about kind of in a very neutral, pseudoscientific or structuralist way, like what a spoiler actually is and how it works.
Yeah, because spoilers, I mean, I just like lore, I guess. I just don't really care about spoilers, but I think I would care about a formal spoiler. Like I don't ever think that what happens in something necessarily can be spoiled, but the way in which it happens can or whatever, or like the form of that thing happening can be spoiled or can be or can at least like knowledge foreknowledge of it can affect how you understand it or something.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I do think that would be really like actually pretty productive to think about. So maybe we'll have to do a spoiler episode sometime.
Yeah, it'll be a spoiler cast, but instead of like spoiling a specific game in the way that that term is used in, video games and TV, commentary, it would be a spoiler cast about the ontology or the essential structure of a spoiler. I'm going to put you on the spot really quick, shifting gears. And I'm sorry we didn't plan this, but you've been texting me and I've seen on your PlayStation, whatever it's called, profile that you've been playing a lot of Call of Duty Modern Warfare.
Yes.
Can you, that's a game that I've never played. So I'd be interested to hear some just initial thoughts about what it is. And I mean, I know what Call of Duty is generally,
Yeah.
but what's compelling about it?
Yeah, so I mean it's largely compelling just because I have memories of playing it. So it came out in the so I haven't I'm trying to remember which would be the last one that I played, and it must have been one that came out when I was in high school. So this one came out in 2007. I'm playing like the remake or whatever for PlayStation 5. But obviously, most of those games are on the Xbox, so some of them you can't. It's unfortunately one of them that I would like to play is not on PS5, hasn't been remade. Um, but anyway, so that one I think is regarded, or at least for a long time was regarded as kind of like the best one or one of the best ones. And there's a kind of simplicity to it. So when you play the updated one, so the way that Call of Duty worked for a long time, I don't know if it still works this way, is that there would be like two studios that would make them and they would alternate. So every other year, a different one would come out. So there's like Call of Duty 1, 2, 3, and then 4 was Modern Warfare. Um, and then there was also Call of Duty Black Ops. So once there was Modern Warfare and Black Ops, those two would kind of switch off back and forth. And like there would be Modern Warfare is obviously like more contemporary. Black Ops would be, I think, like Vietnam and then Cold War. And so they just would go back and forth for years. And both of them, I think, have gotten reboots. So there is like a Call of Duty Modern Warfare that came out in like 2000. Seven, that's the original one, but then there's like another one that just called Call of Duty Modern Warfare that came out in like 2020 or something like that, or a little bit later. So much like other series, they've been rebooted by the same name, but there's also like the original ones with the same name. Um, what's great about Modern Warfare, I think largely has to do with like the maybe the color palette partly. Like there's still a kind of rudimentary aspect to it that I like a lot compared to some of the more recent ones, which I haven't played but have seen footage of. Like some of those have weird sci-fi elements. I mean, a big part of Call of Duty, once you get like a couple games further, would be like the zombies mode. So you could play like Call of Duty Zombies, or I think the first one was Nazi zombies. So you would just have to like kill these Nazi zombies, which is fun in itself, but had much less of the kind of atmosphere that I really loved about the game. But then some of the other ones were more, there was, I think there was one called like Call of Duty, I want to say like Future War or Future Warfare or something like that. And it got like a lot more high tech. I think you could kind of, they did omnidirectional movement where you could kind of go like slide in all directions. Like they just added in way too many controls that made it, uh, I think a little too all over the place without having, they just began to kind of prioritize just like controls and gameplay, which is obviously largely what the game's about, but also graphics in a way, without having the interesting, weird uh, settings that were so great about some of the earlier ones. But yeah, what's good about the game? I mean, I talked about this a little bit in the episode we recorded with James and Eric. I played these games a ton when I was a kid, and they're about or the experience of playing them is largely about the multiplayer. So there are campaigns, but the campaigns are fairly short. Like they're not it's nothing like an open world campaign. You just have to you're just guided through this kind of warfare mission or something, and you kind of jump between characters, and there's some kind of international thing that you always have to do, and it's kind of stupid. Um, but in terms of playing the multiplayer, I think a lot of like the dumbness of the game is both laid bare, but also kind of like redeemed a little bit because you're not really, there's no real mission. It's just like you versus the other side. So there's kind of less of a maybe propagandistic element of it, or you can kind of bracket that a little bit more. And the gameplay is just pure repetition. So like you choose a loadout, have your they call it perks or whatever. So like you have like three perks you can choose. You can choose like extra grenades or extra like your bullets can penetrate through walls more, so you can kill people through a wall. It's all these kind of little calculations you have to make. And then the game is just repetition. You just die and then respawn instantly. You can get kill streaks and get a helicopter and stuff that will get you more kills. So it's all about, I mean, if I wanted to, I haven't really thought this way about it, but I don't know, it's about like accumulation, about maybe ratio. Like you always obviously want to have like a better kill to death ratio. The reason I love them to come back again and try to answer that question is just that I play these games, when you're playing an online multiplayer game, you always have to like wait in the lobby for a certain amount of time, and I think that maybe it's my nature to do this. It certainly is now, but I think even back in the day it was where I would love to kind of jump between usually two different activities. So I would play a match and then read, 5 pages or 10 pages or something, and then play another match and then read a little bit more. So oddly, my experience of reading so many, I guess I won't really go into detail, but of reading so many different books, novels, whatever at that time is like totally colored by playing a bunch of Call of Duty Modern Warfare. And yeah, I mean, it's a dumb game, but there is something just purely pleasurable about it. I think I used the term ambient sociality when we were talking about multiplayer games with Eric and James, and I kind of think there's that too. Like it almost gives me a version of that empty castle or something where I can just be reading and have this in the background. Also, I'll say like the music is pretty good. Like I actually kind of like it's exactly that kind of thing. Like if you think about a movie like I don't know, Black Hawk Down or something like that, like it has that kind of weird like war like digital, but we're in the Middle East, but it's a war in like the early 2000s or something like that kind of music that's meant to be a bit cinematic, if that makes sense. So all these things are impossible. Like none of these are things that I would decide to enjoy, but I think that's why they're more so imprinted on my mind and in terms of still loving this game.
Yeah, that's all super interesting and my you said like um it's just basic I thought I heard you say like it's just compelling to play even if it's hard to sort of explain and
Mm.
I wonder if that's because my understanding of these games is that they're immensely technically accomplished. So it's not just that the graphics look good, but they're really, really smooth to play. The frame rate is rock solid. The movement is really snappy. The guns feel good.
Yeah.
I played Titanfall 2, which was made by I think either by it was published by EA and either made by the Call of Duty studio or by ex devs from the Duty studio. So this is made by Respawn. I think that's like an offshoot maybe of I forget what studio makes Call of Duty.
Yeah.
Um, and that makes me think that I would really like this game. I like shooting. I like
Yeah.
killing
You
things
you
in
you would, I
games.
think. Yeah.
Yeah, and I love games that are smooth and sharp, and punchy like that. Talk about. I have a game to discuss that has some of that too, in a very surprising way from a studio that's not known for that.
Mhm.
Um, but this brings me to another sort of abstract speculation. I've probably said this on the pod before, but I do want to go deep and long at some point on this take, which is that. Call of Duty is often seen as a big bad or as a kind of antithesis, as generic, industrialized, propagandistic,
Mhm.
extravagantly expensive blockbuster series. It's like the most mainstream as you can get in America and therefore disturbing because for its sort of military, whatever. Again, propagandism.
Yeah.
And therefore, there are a lot of, I think, smart games critics, to go back to our conversation with Martin Dolan, like that just instinctively abhor um, Call of Duty and see it as everything wrong with the medium. And more than that, see it as like the antithesis to a more formalistic perspective of games, games for game's sake, and the way we think of like art for art's sake, games that are not cinematic, games that are trying to do interesting things with the pure form of a video game.
Mhm.
We could call this take formalist, you know, and I hate that take because I understand what it's doing. The relationship between games and form is different from many other media. It's often games are compared to film in that sense, where you need to really work to perceive form, and therefore to see the form is a mark of distinction and even cultural capital, certainly a kind of technical expertise that one might say places you apart from the everyday viewer, right, who just watches for the plot. Games aren't like that. So repeating that exercise where you're like, I see through the representation to the form is pretty besides the point. But over and beyond that, technique, that's to say, like technical prowess is form in games. Like to make a game that runs well and looks great and feels really good in the hands, that is a technical accomplishment. That is a formalistic feat of pure, exquisite craft. And so my sense of form and formalism is more, I guess, is actually more on the literary side, in that I think of it ultimately as somewhat analogous to just technique and craft. And Call of Duty seems like, from what especially from in comparison to a game like Titanfall, it's like a formalist masterpiece in that way. Certainly Titanfall is, and I don't mean the kind of creative level design or scenarios you see in Titanfall. I just mean like how it feels to play and how it runs and how it looks. Um, so I'm all for games that do that, particularly dumb games or seemingly dumb games that are about shooting things and looking pretty. Like that's my shit, Like I've said, I think the Uncharted games, Last of Us games, those are great games and those are great expressions of the medium, not purely beyond the storytelling, just for visuals, performance, and combat. So yeah, I am tempted to try the Call of Duty remake at some point, especially because I totally missed them in the 2000s.
Yeah, you should, if you do, definitely make sure you get this one because I think like the other ones that are available on PlayStation 5, I think are only the more recent ones, which I don't think I would touch really. And it's interesting. I mean, this is a different question, but it is kind of interesting to think about a series that has so many entries in it by now, and you would think that in a way you would think that a series that has so many entries you could kind of just pick up any of them, but I also think that that's also just kind of an illusion. Like I think you really need to select carefully and like probably there's a sweet spot, and I think that Modern Warfare, also the original Black Ops was another one that was really good that has I think it was made by the other team that was doing Call of Duty, but that one was also like a really good one. A couple things though, just a couple ideas. You mentioned like the guns or the shooting feels great, and that's definitely, I mean, I do think that's a big part of why, like just when you're hitting somebody, you get like a little X on the screen, like and where the whatever the scope is or something like that, that just indicates that you're doing damage. And just something about that mechanism and like the way that that feels is great. And I often, what I've noticed playing more recently is that you have a decent selection of whatever like equipment you can choose or weapons, but I have figured out, I think, which gun just feels the best to use, and that's the one I will use, even if it has like less accuracy or like maybe is not as effective in long range combat or something like that. And it's just because like it's purely because I want the one that like feels best to use or something like that. And it's a it's a game where people are way too good at it, of course, because it's one of those games where you could think of other games where this would happen. Probably like I would assume the Gears of War games, there are people who like only play Gears of War 2 or something and like have played it for 10 plus years or whatever. It's one of those games where certainly there are going to be people who've like only play this game and are like way too good and will, do a 360 no scope off a building and kill you every time or whatever. Um, but I think like there's something about the way it looks. There's, I feel like you've talked about this before, and I think we've thought about this together a little bit, which is like game spaces that, especially when you're younger, like feel real, not because they're depicted in like a perfect technical way, but just because of there's, I don't know, the ambience of them or something, or some kind of immersion in them, like through your own perspective rather than through like, graphics or something like that. And I do think there's something to be said for that. Now, certainly this is not any kind of, progressive or revolutionary game. But I also think there's something to be said for finding, finding joy in a game that you would like probably disagree with, right? I mean, I think there's something, just like all media, we don't necessarily need to have things spelled out or spoon-fed to us. So I do think it's worth kind of thinking critically about like being able to enjoy something that is like incredibly dumb, like that's like a pure exercise of my faculties to be able to enjoy something that's so stupid,
Can I talk about my game?
Yeah,
Which
go,
is
go
I
ahead.
don't I don't know if I have that much to say about it, especially because I think we're gonna maybe do a podcast later on this series. But I've been playing Fallout 4. I'm now I think 25 hours into it after starting really getting going in earnest a couple weeks ago. And we talked about our history with Bethesda games, I'm almost strictly on the Elder Scrolls side since Morrowind. I've poured hundreds of hours into those games. I played a bit of Fallout 3 when it came out, and I liked it fine, but I just didn't totally commit to it. Um, and I had pretty low expectations for Fallout 4. I got it for like 5.99, when it was upgraded, when there was a PS5 upgrade came out maybe a year ago, and it had been sort of just in the bargain bin on the PS Store for a while. Uh, and I I generally dislike the Fallout aesthetic. So this is something we should save for when we do a full episode on Fallout, but I chafe against the 1950s satire. I just find that to be incredibly tired, and like not creative, again, to level of a fairly crude critique. Um, I don't find it interesting at all. Uh, and
It's really easy for sure.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's really easy. I don't find it funny. And generally, the post-apocalyptic fantasy is one that doesn't appeal to me, especially with like raiders and, radiation everywhere, and whatever, combing through bombed out cities. That stuff, I think there's some people who get a pure sort of immediate and visceral pleasure from just that ambiance, that kind of environment, just in the way that I get pleasure from going through an enchanted forest in a game, or again, like exploring an empty castle in a video game. So that's just like that's just taste, I can't really justify that in any way. It just doesn't click for me. And then, of course, I'd heard that this is the game where Bethesda really lost its magic. I think, the first big Bethesda release since Morrowind that wasn't unanimously loved by critics, if not by players. I think I got strong reviews, but not amazing reviews, and players, I think, are pretty sour on it. At least that's my understanding of the general fan consensus. Partly because it just totally guts the RPG systems. There's very little RPGing. There isn't much in the way of dialogue trees, I think, or story decisions other than a big story branching paths thing that is very elaborate, more elaborate than anything in the other games, as I understand it, the other Bethesda games. So you have to give them some credit for going all in. They're basically four different ending paths that are very substantial based on which faction you choose, and the game mandates that you choose a faction at the end. That's just, I haven't gotten there yet. That's just what I've read. So I think that some of the discontent with the game comes from that. But my impression has been incredibly positive. Like, I am loving my time with this game, all those caveats, whatever, or all my misgivings having been registered. Um, I think it's just a really well-made and fun game. And I'll just highlight two things about it for now. One is the world design. So um, I had no excitement for exploring a ruined Boston, partly because, sorry, Brian, I hate Boston. I mainly just hate Boston sports. Boston's all right, I guess. But this is like my Philly bias coming into. And so, like, exploring whatever Fenway Park, converted to a survivalist, uh, like commune, just wasn't appealing to me. That just sounded annoying. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, just like 50s satire, I feel like Boston setting is very easy to do and
Yeah.
also, really overblown if you're actually from around Boston. Like there's so
Yeah.
much about like Boston stereotypes that are like, okay, yeah, kind of true, but like not really, Like
Yeah. And this is more of my just aesthetic, whatever, purely subjective aesthetic distaste. But World War II and the Revolutionary War, I just have no time for those. Like, I don't, I think a tri-point hat just makes me annoyed, and seeing a musket makes me want to like turn the TV off. So the fact that it's trafficking in like
yeah,
Revolutionary War paraphernalia, right? This is in the way that
yeah.
Boston itself does or New England does. I spent a lot of time there.
Mm.
Um, I'm just like fuck off with that. Get your baseball. I don't want to see your baseball, and I don't want to see your tri-point hats.
This is just an errant thought, but I wonder if then if it's possible to like a game that's about where you're from, uh,
Mm.
or a piece of media even. Just a question, I guess, for another time, but it makes me Because yeah, I mean, I love Fallout 3, and that's like set in DC, and I like know nothing about
Yeah.
DC. I've been there, I think, once or twice, and that's essentially it, you know?
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, I've lived in DC for years. I have a lot of family from the DC area. That's where my dad grew up.
mm,
And I didn't like the setting in Fallout
mm,
3. But
yeah.
I think, I love movies set in Philadelphia if they're good Philly movies. So I don't think there have been any games set in Philadelphia, at least not in the way that like a Fallout game is.
Yeah,
If that
yeah.
happened, I would be definitely intrigued. But Philly is a it's an environment that's pretty hostile to game conventions, I think.
Mm,
Partly, yeah, we can talk. That's the topic for another day. We should do an episode on just like making a game from where you're from.
sure, yeah.
But that was all to say, like the aesthetics, the dress, the set dressing, the vibe, not appealing. But the pure design of ruined Boston is pretty extraordinary. It's nothing like Skyrim. It is a entire level above, multiple levels above. I guess literally and figuratively in that what you get is an actual city, an actual dense city full of like winding streets or, abandoned streets, parking garages, hospitals, shops, skyscrapers, and so many of them are traversable. Like you can just go into buildings. It's that Bethesda thing where there are a good amount of like boarded up storefronts, which is classic game code for we don't have time to design this, But it's a city that has the most traversable interiors of any game that I've ever played. And when you add the fact that there's rubble, there's like a highway system that's collapsed that you can explore, there are so many different levels in terms of you know, I'm having a hard time speaking and talking this morning, but like, you know, floors, I guess, floors to the environment. So you can be, hundreds of feet up above the main open world and still sort of be interacting with the open world. You can take elevators to the very top of a skyscraper. You can take bridges, sky bridges, or ruined, traverse like beams or rubble or whatever to go between skyscrapers, hundreds of feet above the ground. You can go down below to the train system, sinkholes. It's this incredible feat of like vertical spatial design, especially for an open world game. It's just stunning. And it really, I've never played a game where it truly feels like you are inhabiting an entire, an entire multi-leveled developed urban space, which is so difficult. Grand Theft Auto can't do it. Like Grand Theft Auto, there are basically no interiors, but Fallout 4 has so many interiors and they're like so tightly bunched together. You'll come upon an abandoned street and you can like go into the diner, you can go into the bookshop, you can go into all these places, but also explore like a ruined building that's like half in the world map and half not. Normally in Elder Scrolls games or Bethesda games, there are like the multiple tiers of interior, yeah, where you either load into a discrete space or it's like half in, half out. You can walk through a ruined doorway and actually explore inside a diner that is just open in the open air because a wall has been blown out of it, and therefore you're in an interior space without having to load in, which is very cool. And there's a lot more of that. Fallout 4 is full of that, whereas there is basically no equivalent in the Elder Scrolls games. There is no like you're either loading into a building or you're walking around outside or in the street. There's very little in between. A street market is the only thing that comes close. But Fallout 4 has actual buildings you can go inside of. Um, so that part, all that stuff is amazing, and I think Bethesda hasn't gotten enough credit now that have not having done all the research and actually missed the time. I wasn't playing games when Fallout 4 came out. I don't think they've gotten enough credit for just how much they elevated the complexity and the density of their environment design for Fallout 4. And then the second thing is like, it's just that the game feels good to play. This is partly because it's running on PS5. It's at 60 frames, a very smooth 60 FPS. But the shooting I really, really like. It's simplistic. The AI isn't anything special, but it feels great to shoot people in the head. Whether in the sort of semi-turn-based VAT system, which I understand is a staple of the series,
Yeah.
just in real time, Call of Duty-esque, like duck under cover and pop people off, pop out and shoot them with a scope, you know. And that the immediacy, the speed, I think the sound effects of the rifles, I use a combat rifle that just like it's this deafening echo throughout the wasteland when you fire off a shot. A single shot just has this reverberation that's so loud and so incredibly satisfying. The guns just really pop, you know. That level of that, the kind of immediacy, indeed, yes, the violence. Um, and I need to think more about the right way to articulate the exact sort of tactile active quality, but something about a Bethesda game where you're shooting,
Mm.
where you're aiming, you're therefore traversing distances visually,
Yeah.
you're aiming your scope all over these multi-leveled environments, and therefore, in a way, like inhabiting them at a deeper level than you do in Skyrim. And yes, in Skyrim you can point your bow and arrow in places, but you're not just like you don't see the world through a bow and arrow. Whereas Fallout 4 is a shooter, so you see the world through your scope. And that means the entire world is concrete
Hmm.
at every level, not just 360 degrees, but up above and down below too. And because you're always looking through your scope, or down your sights, like distant detail is much more actualized than it is in Skyrim. In Skyrim, partly because of the rendering limitations, like anything beyond, say, 50 feet is just kind of a blurry mess and doesn't actually really exist for all intents and purposes. Um, and then the bow and arrow is a pretty cumbersome item to use anyway. So the fact that like you're in this world of honestly unparalleled detail. I don't know if there's been a single game as with the granular detail and density and scope of Fallout 4 ever that I've played. And this is a game that's over 10 years old. Um, all of that becomes actualized because of the way that you see the world, the way that you perceive it, and your primary axis of interaction, which is shooting. Um, which is to say that this makes Fallout 4 the most, I want to say, like ontologically thick and solid of Bethesda games that I've played in an incredibly satisfying way, and I should say an incredibly immersive way. I
Mm.
wasn't expecting, especially because I was so negative about the vibe and aesthetic of the game. I wasn't expecting to be immersed, but I really am just like totally absorbed when I'm playing Fallout 4.
Yeah, I mean, I have a bunch of thoughts. I think I would say that because I love Fallout 3 and I also love in terms of the Elder Scrolls games, I love Oblivion. Like I think I always liked Oblivion more than Skyrim. I just played more of it, I think, and also I would have to actually sit down and compare them because I played Skyrim more recently, of course, but I think there have to be some other differences in there that I just prefer, you know. But I think I would agree that the Fallout games are more realistic in a certain way, even though, of course, there are like mutants and stuff. And I think it has to do with and I agree about like some of the content too. Like 50s satire is automatically cartoonish, you know, it's automatically just kind of, I mean, the parts of Infinite Jest that are most annoying are the parts about the president who seems like this kind of like future version of like a 50s like guy who becomes the president, you know, like Johnny Gentle who's a crooner and all this stuff, whatever it is. So like I kind of have that same distaste for that gesture of looking backward and then forward from the scope of the 50s because it's like 50s futurism or whatever. But I also think, you know, you're talking about the space and I think space and form um and particularly like the experience of form you can have in those games is kind of amazing. And I think that's part of what makes Fallout yeah, more realistic and in a way that makes it more satisfying to play or like more thought-provoking to play. I mean, as dumb as it is, I feel like the Elder Scrolls games are kind of dumber, you know, in in a certain way at least, right? Like they're kind of more cartoonish ultimately, even though the content of Fallout is more cartoonish. Like Fallout for me is the game where getting to the edge of the world is like the most, that's Fallout 3, getting to the end of the map in Fallout 3, I think out of any game ever is probably like the most, whatever, the best experience I've ever had of getting to like the edge of a map in a game. And I wonder why that is. I guess I would have to go and like play around with that a little bit and see. But I mean, I used to love trying to just discover every single area on the map. Like that would be my main, that would be my quest or whatever that I was doing in those games, just discovering everything on the map because um, there are these kind of hidden things that feel deeper than Easter eggs. Because yeah, of course, there are going to be Easter eggs. There are these jokes in there. There's all sorts of little references and stuff like that. That are usually funny or humorous, and there's some stuff that's dark, but I found always like the formal Easter eggs were the most interesting ones. One thing I'll say too about the combat, like I kind of, I might be misremembering. I think I liked the VATS combat, but a lot of times I was not a huge fan of the non-VATS shooting, but I also wonder if that's if I'm mostly thinking of like incredibly high health enemies because I think that there's a very unsatisfying thing about the game where the enemies can be so persistent. Like if you attack an enemy or if an enemy sees you and they just completely outrank you, you're kind of fucked. Like your game, you're gonna have to it's kind of impossible to outrun enemies sometimes. Like it's really difficult from what I remember, and it can be kind of disconnected feeling to try to actually shoot at those enemies. But yeah, what do you
Yeah. That's my memory of Fallout 3, which again I played pretty close to on release. That the real-time combat was terrible, and you were really just using bats. And here Fallout is has become a really good shooter. It's far better than Grand Theft Auto. I mean, it's like night and day compared to Grand Theft Auto. Even compared to a game like Metro Exodus, which is a dedicated first-person shooter, I think it's really interesting and in some ways impressive first-person shooter in a similarly apocalyptic radiation. There's a radiation mechanic in that too. The shooting in that game sucks. Actually, it's not good shooting. It doesn't feel good. The enemies don't behave in a satisfying way. Actually, the enemy AI in Metro Exodus is significantly worse than the enemy AI in Fallout 4, believe it or not. And Metro Exodus came out, I think, in 2019. Um, but I want to venture another schematic breakdown slash theory in comparison to compare Fallout, and particularly Fallout 4 to the Elder Scrolls games. I want to say that your engagement with reality and the world in Elder Scrolls is dyadic, which means it there's a lot going on, right? You're in this giant space full of detail, full of objects, full of NPCs, but you're ultimately at any given moment zeroed in on one particular entity. So if you're shooting a bandit with an arrow, you're zoomed in on that bandit. You're not really taking account of or even acknowledging the existence really of the other bandits in the room, the other objects in the room, or you're picking up an object and therefore the rest of the universe ceases to exist. And that's partly because in Bethesda games, right, when you're looking through your inventory, the game freezes and you're out of time and have the leisure to peruse your inventory for hours in the middle of combat. Or if you're engaging with a shopkeeper, right, it's just you and the shopkeeper, everything else falls away. So there are so many points of interest, and I don't mean that in the Bethesda game world map sense of like here's a mountaintop or a waterfall, but points of interest in your sensorium, as you step into a design space, you could fix on any number of objects around you. Again, like physical objects, enemies, right, merchants, doors, etc. But you're always going to be in an essentially one-to-one relationship with that thing until you switch attention to something else. And it makes Skyrim feel like this giant, I don't know what the metaphor is, like a switchboard or something, where you're just like you're turning on these different nodes, and when you turn on one node, it shuts almost everything else off, which makes it a very, in a way, um, minimal representation of reality, even though it's so maximalist and so detailed in the ways that we've talked about before that make Bethesda games totally unique. Um, there's a kind of impoverishment, a kind of phenomenological impoverishment to the Elder Scrolls avatar, in that they're only interacting with one discrete aspect of reality at a given time. But in Fallout, your engagement is synthetic. And so that partly means that early on in Fallout 4, like, an hour in, you get the Fat Man weapon, which fires a mini nuke. And the mini nuke shoots an actual like nuclear blast. It's not an actual, it's not a full-size nuclear blast. It's a mini nuclear blast, but it has a blast radius, of say 50 feet, and will clear out an entire courtyard full of enemies. And the mere existence of that weapon means that, as in Halo, as in other first-person shooters, you're inherently interacting with an entire space. You're not just one-to-one dyadically operating or interfacing with one node in this simulated world. Like the entire world is turned on for you and responds to you at once, you know? So the mini nuke for me is a kind of like it's a case study or emblem of the way that the Fallout avatar interacts with the simulated reality. All again, like all corners, all anything you can see is active, is alive because you can shoot it. And shooting it doesn't winnow your focus in the way that pointing an arrow does in Elder Scrolls. Like shooting something is this immediate engaging, or rather an immediate form of engagement. There's almost no barrier between like when you press the button, when you aim, press the button, and therefore pop someone in the head or shoot, a barrel or something. Um, so this is just to sum up, like Fallout, I think it feels more real to me and feels more immersive than Skyrim, even though I would probably gun to my head say I prefer, a pipe gun to my head, as it were. I'd say I prefer Skyrim. Um, it just feels like a more physically complex and realized and again immersive world, because it's you and your entire sensorium are online, right? All at the same time.
And everything, I would just to maybe close us out here, like I would say that it feels more real too because things are in various states of decomposition in a way that they're not in the Elder Scrolls games, right? And of course, it's not that you play 100 hours and things deteriorate even more because that doesn't really happen. But so everything is created as a ruin already. So obviously, we have to understand that that's like how the game was made. But I do think that that sense of decomposition, which you can also experience as a character, right? When you get like irradiated, there are these status effects that are I don't think we have the same thing in the Elder Scrolls games, right? Like you can have some status effects, but uh they're not ones of disintegration in the same way, which I think is whatever, it's a thematically relevant thing, but it's also like formally relevant to this idea of being in the space, I think, right? And I mean that's one of the best things about the game for me is seeing there's a moment in I think it's Fallout 3 where you see this overpass, but it's just like a fragmented overpass, which is something that there's stuff like that in Elden Ring, right? Where you see like a bridge that's broken in half and you kind of can't use most of it or whatever, right? Or you can only get to some of it. And I mean, obviously Elden Ring, there's ruins everywhere, but seeing that in the context of like a whatever it's like 22 something like the time, right? So we're 200 something years in the future. There's something about that I think is really effective in terms of imagining realistic in quotations, I guess, but imagining like realistic ruins that aren't like fantasy ruins, which I think is really another thing to me that brings the space alive for these games.
That's such a good point about different stages of decomposition because in Skyrim or Elder Scrolls, we basically get two. We get ruined, dwarven ruin,
Mm,
right? Ruined. I keep repeating myself in this episode, but or you get just a totally pristine castle and
yeah.
city, and
Yeah.
there's no in between really. Whereas in Fallout, you have this like pretty varied scale or spectrum of
Mhm.
ruinedness, that. I mean, to use the kind of shitty academic word is more, I guess, palimpsestial or something. Like there's just more of a kind of architectonic and archaeological complexity and historic complexity to these spaces, just on the level of you can go to a 50% ruined building, a 25% ruined building, and a 75% ruined building or whatever.
Well, it's more fragmentary because the fragment needs to include 0%, but it also needs to include 100%, right?
Yeah,
It's not like ruins on or off as if you had like a switch
exactly.
to turn them
Yeah,
on or
Skyrim
off.
has a ruin filter where you
Yeah,
can leave
yeah.
it on in certain dungeons and turn it off, and that's
Yeah.
really it,
Yeah,
you know.
exactly. Yeah. So yeah, I guess the final thing I'll mention is that I've been reading, as I know I keep kind of telling you, I've been reading a few things by Thomas Bernhard, who I just really love, and I think I first heard of him actually through Defensive Judgment by Michael Clune because he has that chapter on woodcutters, which is the first thing I read. I think even just from Clune's kind of discussion of it and description of it, I knew I would enjoy it. So I know about whatever five or 6 years ago, I went and read Woodcutters and have reread it since then. Just a truly excellent book. But then recently, I read Bernhard's memoirs, which are collected under the title Gathering Evidence. And he had a really, I guess just quickly, he had like a pretty difficult and pretty amazing life. He's Austrian. I think he passed away in 1989. That sounds right. I think he was in his 50s or something like that. Anyway, so he was he was an Austrian youth during around the time of World War II. So he was, had to be in the Hitler Youth and grew up kind of alternating between that and like various Catholic schools. He had didn't ever know his father, had kind of an abusive mother, really had this like close connection to his grandfather, who was also a writer, but was just a really bizarre guy who would keep a loaded revolver at his writing desk in case he ever had to kill himself. So Bernhard kind of grew up under these really harsh conditions, and you can kind of tell through his writing, like the biggest um, characteristic of his writing that listeners might kind of recall that when we talked about Bennett Sims, Portinaccio Sarcophagus by Sims kind of definitely takes, including other stories as well, it definitely takes some inspiration from Bernhard, but he writes in these long block paragraphs with no breaks at all, and his writing is incredibly recursive and repetitive. And I would say that, for listeners who are, maybe interested or maybe wondering if they'd like Bernhard, if you like Beckett, I think you would like Bernhard a lot. Like if you like Beckett's prose in particular, there's this kind of endlessness to it. But there's also a really wry kind of strange humor, and I think part of what I love about it is this kind of refusal to either be optimistic or nihilistic, right? Or to be like a pessimist or an optimist. There's this kind of more real, I think, realistic kind of laughter in the face of some of these kind of harsher truths or something like that. Um, and you see that in his memoirs. I mean, there's a whole a scene that I talked about recently because I went on the Hermitics podcast to talk about the memoirs, but I'll mention it again here. There's a moment where when he was a teenager, he got tuberculosis and he was essentially supposed to die. Like he should have died. Like he was very, very ill, and he was in essentially like a terminal award for like terminal patients as he was like 17 or 18 or something. And he was there among all these old men who were just like, he watched a lot of these people die. And there's a part where he talks about, let me see if I can quickly find the line because it's pretty amazing. Um, he's talking about seeing these men walk around with these bottles of like fluid that they're coughing up from their lungs, and he says, "It is as though they had no more important mission in life than to produce sputum and urge one another on to ever greater sputum production." So there's this kind of like, and it just, of course, makes me think of like the stone sucking part from Malloy, right? There's this kind of like, in order to pass the time, we need to like be just almost having a contest about how much we can hack up in terms of like this nasty mucus or whatever. Anyway, I don't want to get too stuck on just that scene, though I do love it. I also recently read his novel Correction, which is about one characteristic in common among a lot of his novels is that the protagonist has a friend or an acquaintance who has killed themselves, and so the protagonist is kind of like not necessarily picking up the pieces, but is kind of in this kind of removed way, but also very insightful way, taking account of that person's life. So it's not, I don't know, which I think is kind of unique among fiction. I don't know that I can necessarily think of anything else that I've read that has that same kind of perspective where it's not really a tragedy, right? Like it's something where the protagonist will say, maybe this was a tragedy, but it's kind of more like wondering if that was a tragedy at all. And so Correction, it's about the protagonist's friend who the protagonist is in charge of like arranging this friend's literary output basically or philosophical output. A lot of the characters are either like novelists or musicians or philosophers or whatever. And so this character who had killed himself had built what's just referred to in the novel as the cone. And so he built this big cone, like conic structure in the woods, and it was supposed to be a kind of tribute for his sister to live in. And as soon as the cone was finished, his sister died. And then, like, sometime after that, he like just hung himself in the woods. Um, and it's very difficult, to describe the plots because they're usually taking place much like the Bennett Sims within a pretty short span of time, like maybe one sitting or one evening or something like that. And there's just this repetition that goes sometimes all the way far back into childhood and then kind of back to the present moment. And there's this odd kind of oscillation between these different times. But I don't know like how to really explain it, but there's an access onto something. It makes me think about certain types of repetitive music or like almost like serial compositions or something where we have like the same handful of elements that are repeated and recombined and eventually will reach a new kind of pitch. Almost, at random, if that makes sense. And I think something about that repetition, something about that kind of endlessness to me is a different way of experiencing literature. So I know I don't think you have read Bernhard yet, but I'm going to say again that you absolutely should. He's is really amazing. Like all of his stuff is kind of the same, but it's also not, there's a new joy with each one that I read. And so right now I'm actually reading, he has one called Wittgenstein's Nephew, because apparently Bernhard actually knew Wittgenstein's, I think it was technically his great nephew or grandnephew. I don't know how you would say that, but it's kind of more of a autobiographical one where Bernhard's character or the narrator is in basically like a TB ward for his lungs or his chest, and Wittgenstein's nephew is across the street in like a mental facility, and it's just a kind of a meditation on their friendship.
That all sounds great. I haven't read Bernhard, but I want to, if I really need to read more. I don't know if I've mentioned in this podcast, but I basically never read outside of my job when I am forced to read or must read.
Yeah.
So I need to work on that. Maybe that's a resolution for the new year. I'll just say quickly. You compared Bernhardt to Beckett. I had a fleeting thought for a moment, like what is the Venn diagram of people who play games and read Samuel Beckett? It's probably yeah, that's our audience,
Yeah, sure, sure.
But
I mean, Jonathan Bolter, he's one.
exactly.
Yeah.
Hey Jonathan, if you're listening. But it's funny because of all the great modernists or even great authors, like Beckett seems like maybe the one most likely to have made a video game. If he had lived a little, I mean, he died in '89, right? So he died really late. Like Atari, Nintendo existed.
Yeah.
Maybe there's a world where Beckett, I'm not sure how he was doing, in the '80s, but where Beckett saw somebody playing Super Mario Brothers or something, but he was so experimental. He was so willing to embrace various media, not just the stage and
Yeah.
novels and poetry, but radio, I think he did stuff for TV or wanted to do stuff
Yeah.
for
Well,
TV.
and Beckett had a real awareness of form too that I think
Yes,
like I wonder I could almost see Joyce doing an adaptation of one of his stories as a game, which would not work, but Beckett would do something totally entirely different, which would
exactly.
feel like his fiction or feel like his poetry, but would be something totally something else.
Yeah, and I have
Yeah.
a course on aesthetic difficulty, which is basically a course on modernism in games, and I haven't taught it for a few years now. But we read late Beckett, we read Wordsworth Ho, and then
Mhm.
we compare it to we've read it I think alongside the game Limbo, which is a game I dumped on with Marty Dolan recently. But
Yeah.
it is a good comparison piece, and yeah, you're right. I think Beckett wouldn't have adapted one of his works. Beckett would have done something experimental, or he would have done something that activates something inherent to the game medium. And of course, games are repetitive, games are minimalist, games are
Mhm.
ontologically impoverished in all of the ways that we've been describing, both in this episode and throughout this podcast. So yeah, it's funny. It's like the Venn diagram may be quite small, but little do the rest of you all know, like Beckett himself could have been the one, if he had
Yeah.
lived into the 90s. I would love like the Samuel Beckett PlayStation 1 launch title. Like little like weird launch games are they often these like weird ass games just slip in, because it's like the console needs to just fill out its library. And I love imagining this version of where a little curio by Beckett is included. Maybe it's a pre-installed game or a preloaded game or demo disc or something. Um, the other thing, I guess I'll end with this. I want to say it was the last Formless One we did. I ended by talking about a dream, which I know is bad form. It's bad audio, but I'm gonna do it anyway, just because, as you mentioned, the stone sucking scene in Malloy, where a character Malloy describes for pages and pages about his method, his scientific method for rotating the stones that he's sucking from his coat pockets to his mouth. Um, I had a dream last night. I remembered suddenly that somebody, I was at like a banquet and somebody, maybe a kid, was like sucking stones. And my thought was, A, that happens in Malloy. I should mention that. And B, like that seems really dangerous. Someone needs to get those stones away from that kid.
Yeah.
That's the end of my, that's where it all ends. But it is funny. This is again like how brain rotted I am is I live or I dream Elden Ring and Malloy
And Malloy.
back
I
to back.
wonder. Yeah, I wonder like what it would be now that it's an interesting thought experiment of how imagining what Beckett would make as a game, right? Because if it can't be an adaptation, it wouldn't be. People would want to say it's a stone sucking simulator, but it's not that. That's too cheap. That would be like his mobile game that he made for extra bucks once he sold out or whatever. Um,
I mean, SSS is a pretty good title. Like it's like S3, Stone. It's like the Candy Crush for Samuel Beckett fans.
Or it would be like SSSAAS, Stone Sucking Simulator as a Service or whatever. Um, no, but like, how would you make a game that's about nothing or a game that's maybe not saying nothing but playing nothing or something? Because I feel like that would be, if his literature was trying to like say nothing or destroy language or however he puts it, I think maybe the game would have to try to do the same thing, and I wonder what that would look like or what that would be.
Yeah, maybe this should be our pensive text for the week. Let's
Yeah.
end by trying to imagine a game that says nothing, or as you put it, even better, a game that plays nothing.
Mm,
Um, I think we should wrap here.
sure.
That works, but until then, Brian, just remember to keep that magic lantern lit.
Will do.